the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt is still intact. And it has so far withstood some very severe tests. The assassination of Sadat, his successor Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak, has carried out Sadat's policies meticulously, in my judgment. Secondly, the very difficult withdrawal by Israel from the Sinai region and the dismantling of settlements, something that Begin had earlier sworn never to do. Third, the annexation of the Golan Heights, which was a violation of some of the principles in the Camp David Accords, and I think more seriously perhaps the invasion by Israel of Lebanon with a very bloody and costly war for all concerned. But in spite of all that, the peace treaty between Israel and the preeminent Arab nation on earth is still there. On the other hand, no progress has been made at all in carrying out the basic provisions of the Camp David Accords. The Israelis have not been willing to give the Palestinians basic human rights, nor have they been willing to give the promised full autonomy to the Palestinians who live in the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza primarily. On the other hand, the Palestinians nor the Jordanians have so far been willing to join the peace talks, and now they've broken down completely. Our nation has withdrawn, in effect, from active participation in the negotiations. We've not had any sustained effort to bring the disputing parties together. And this is a radical departure from what had been the case under my own administration, under the previous administrations of Nixon and Ford, with Kissinger practicing shuttle diplomacy. So I would say that in the Middle East, no progress is being made, partially because of a default by our own government. As far as nuclear war is concerned, it's important to remember that of all the worldwide alerts which have brought to a state of extreme readiness the nuclear power of the superpowers, every time it's been because of a confrontation in the Middle East. I think this brings to us a very clear picture that a superpower confrontation which might result in a nuclear exchange is likely to come not from an altercation directly between the Soviet Union and the United States, but because of some trouble spot on Earth, Central America, or perhaps in the Western Pacific in the future, or more likely in the Middle East. So the threat is still there, and one of the major lessons to be learned from the past is not a dormancy or the acceptance of inevitability of extended peace, just because the horrors of nuclear war are so foreboding, but a realization that we as a nation of extreme influence must actively practice peace. We must wage peace. We can't take anything for granted.
The only image of women after World War II, bringing back old prejudices of women as childlike, not quite human, and so on, dressed up in Freudian and modern sociological terms and pressed by the mass media, defining women only in terms of her sexual relation to man and as a wife, mother, housewife, server of physical needs, husband, children, home, and not as a person, denying her own personhood and defining herself by her own actions in society. It wasn't so much that I said women shouldn't have fulfillment in marriage and motherhood and home, but to define woman only in those terms denies the personhood of woman. And we had to break through that feminine mystique and assert the personhood of women, even to demand our American birthright, equal opportunity and equal rights. And in fact, that's what the women's movement is and was all about, the personhood of women, and then our human and American birthright of equal opportunity and equal voice.
The problem with white people is they very seldom confront each other on this issue. Blacks always must confront whites, but rarely we find a white confronting a white in behalf of black people. Most whites are silent observers who suffer like guilt, or feel ashamed, or embarrassed, but they do nothing to change it. Another point is that for a white person to fight racism gives them no personal reward. It gives them grief. So therefore, in order for you to be non-racist, you must suffer. And that's the essence of what really freedom, without the cross, there's no crown, you see. If I am to be free, you must start hurting. And the problem with most white people is they don't want to hurt.
Nobody wants to report anything but the truth. We're not trying to tell you something that is not true. We're just trying to tell it to you, the truth, and trying to get it And when you have 6 or 11 announcements in the White House each day maybe put out, and the press are trying to go by, it takes time and money to search out these facts, and each one of those things has to be looked into. Why, that's what we need. We need more reporters, and we need more investigative reporters.
I went out on the front steps on the street and did a portrayal of Barabbas. And I did 2 a day thereafter for that week.
How did you do that? Can you describe that a little bit?
How did I do that? I just walked out front of the convention building, and there were some seats in an open area, and I said, I'd like everybody's attention. I would like to share something. And I was in costume and makeup, similar to now, and I said, visiting you today would be Barabbas. And I gave a story or a portrayal of Barabbas. And I, as an aside, want to say that there was this man who was about 3,000 sheets to the wind over there, almost asleep. Barabbas speaks like, "Oh, don't look at me that way, like I'm some," and he goes on. Well, this guy woke up, and he straightened up, and he listened to Barabbas all the way through on the street. Well, when Barabbas finished, people started walking away, and some came up and said, "Thank you," and "Gee, that was interesting," or "helpful." There's this old man down there, and still, I wasn't sure he was all together, but he was talking to this lady. Finally, this guy disappeared, and this lady came up, and she said, "Chuck, would you like to know what this man felt about what you just did?" And I said, "Sure," because he's a man out in the marketplace. He said, "Well, I asked him," I said, "Sir, what did you think of that man, Barabbas?" And she said, well, that man turned to me and said, "That's my kind of guy."
We really never expected, you know, to stop the submarine. We wanted to slow it down. We did succeed in delaying it for 8 days. We waited 8 days for it to come while they gathered 99 Coast Guard boats to defeat our little flotilla of dinghies. It was really kind of funny. It was symbolic. And what we wanted really was a day in court, that we might present the case of what we were doing, you see. And so it was to get arrested, really. That was basically our principle. And we didn't like to call it civil disobedience. I like the term that Dr. Douglas gives us. It was loving disobedience. And it wasn't against people. It was against this monster that represented death so tremendously to us. We had beautiful rapport with some of the young folks who had to handcuff us, for instance, and do these other things.
Hope and confidence are indispensable to a democratic political system and to a free enterprise economy. We have, in the last 20 years especially, been concentrating on the negative, the violent, the controversial. I think perhaps beginning with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, followed by the deaths of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., the attempts on George Wallace and Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan, the tragedy of Vietnam, the extraordinary events of Watergate, followed by a recession and unemployment, inflation, various problems of that sort. And so we're in the habit of cutting ourselves to pieces. The growing competition among the news media tends to concentrate on the dramatic, the bold, the eye-catching, and that itself creates a distortion in the picture of the world about us. For example, we've now put behind us 38 years since a nuclear weapon has been fired in anger. Have you seen a television special on telling the dramatic story of how that came about, given all the crises we've had since 1945?
No.
Last year, or the year before, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta and the World Health Organization announced that smallpox has disappeared from the human race. This great killer of mankind is gone. Now that came about because governments all over the world who had the most far-reaching differences among themselves put their heads together and eliminated smallpox. We just don't get that other side of the human story.
What moved me was a movie called The Word, and it was a blasphemous movie. It depicted Jesus as a kind of prophet who got carried away, and supposedly was crucified and faked it. Oh, it angered me no end. I realized that the station I was producing in was going to air that program. So I asked the manager, I said, are you going to air this program? He said, yes. I said, you a Christian? He said, yes. I said, how can you air this? It's a blasphemous movie. Oh, he said, do you think God cares? Well, by that time, my Italian temper was going this way, you know? And I said, yes, he cares, and I care. You going to air it or not? So he looks at me like men look at women sometimes, you know, and he says, are you telling me what to air on my station?
Well.
And I said, me? No, I wouldn't do that. I just want to know if you're going to air this program. You got crummy programs on this station. And I've never said a word to you.
You said this
about your crummy programs. So this time, I have a red spot in the back of my neck, and when it gets hot, the Lord is saying, Angelica, watch it. And it was getting hot. So he says to me, I said, okay, are you going to air this? He said, yes. I said, okay, you made a decision, I'll make one. I will no longer produce here, and I will not air my programs on this station. So he looks at me and he says, you leave this station, you're off of television. And I said, oh no, I don't need you. I only need God. I'll build my own, which is what you call having a big mouth.
What happened to us while we were there, we didn't know. We still don't know. We still cannot comprehend. We cannot rationalize why it happened. Because in those days, you lived from minute to minute, not even from day to day, because every day was like a year, like ages, like an eternity. And we didn't know what the next day is going to bring, because the premeditated plan, as you mentioned, and the systematic extermination by modern techniques like the transports, and so many people have to die or be gassed a day, we could not comprehend this kind of logic, if there was any logic. Personally, I was one of the people who were, from the first day since the Germans came into Poland, when they invaded Poland September the 1st, 1939, I was a youngster, a young teenager. And little did we understand, or myself, because I was the oldest of 5 children, and my little brother was only 3 years old, maybe not even 3. And we always looked up to our peers, especially to parents. This is the way I was brought up. And whatever my father did or didn't do, whatever his reaction was, it was mine. And we really lived every day as a miracle, every hour as a miracle. To give you just an example, the very second day when the Germans came in, they started already gathering up the people for forced labor. Labor that was not needed. It was not a productive labor. It was simply a labor of pain and agony and mockery, like taking stones from one side of the street and carrying to the other side of the street, and the next day taking the same stones and vice versa, bringing it back to the original place. Taking old people and making one riding piggyback on the other, and the German soldiers standing around and laughing, or shaving off half beards, just a half of the beard with the bayonets, not with a razor. So this, simply watching this, made one feel like, you know, are we human, or are we pests, or are we lower than beasts? Because beasts were doing it. Beasts and human images were doing this to other humans. And so what is one to do? I mean, as far as resistance, people ask the question, why didn't you resist? Personally, in our house, nobody used a gun. It was against our belief. to use weapons. But we had a weapon. We had a little religion. I mean, not a little, we had a lot of religion, because I was brought up in a strictly Orthodox home. So we used our weapon, prayer.
And I suddenly began to study things in a kind of context and with some kind of continuity, and things that I had sort of taken for granted because I'd heard it all my life suddenly began to come alive. And you know, I found that I was so thirsty.
Did you know what was happening to you at the time? Did you know that
No.
God was becoming real to you?
No, I didn't know that he wasn't real to me. I mean, you know, I mean, a nominal Christian doesn't realize they're a nominal Christian. I don't say, hello, how do you do there? My name is Ann B. Davis, nominal Christian. You know, we're as Christian as we know how to be. I didn't know that I was missing anything or what I was missing. But it just began to take on a sense of reality and a sense of immediacy. Now, as an actor, that's a phrase that we use where, you know, you take the same line that you've said it for 150 times in a series of performances, and every time you have got to make that sound as if you had never said it before, although the words are there. You know, the words have been stored in your brain, you've rehearsed it and performed it. And that's what began to happen to me from these phrases from the Bible, which I had had read to me, of course, 2 or 3 snippets out of every service. And suddenly, you know, they'd go boing, like I'd never heard. There was immediacy, there was a presence, there was something that was important to me now. And I can remember the first phrase that did that to me came out of my strange feeling of discontent when I had everything. And it's John 10:10, when Jesus says, I come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. And let me tell you, when I heard that, I mean really heard that, my spirit just soared. Because at last, here was somebody who knew I was not living the abundant life. Never mind what the world said. He knew I was not living the abundant life, and he knew what was missing. And that's what I begin to count the beginning of my own particular spiritual walk.